Nick Majerison here, welcome to Top Med Talk. Time now for today's Top Med Talk from Mike Grocott. The Measurement of Exercise Tolerance Before Surgery, METS, Study, Early Results. This is a presentation that was given at the POETTS Annual Congress at the beginning of July of this year and broadcast live at the time on topmedtalk.com. Have a listen.
Top Med Talk.
Next speaking we have Professor Mike Grocott, presently the Professor of Anaesthesia of Critical Care Medicine at the University of Southampton. If you read the bio that's in ITBOM, there's a man with many hats who seems to be doing very many things, including finding the time to come and speak to us today on METS. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and talk about METS. So it's only newly published, and it's a study that I have been involved with almost since the beginning, but it's very interesting to see it finally published and think about the journey along the way. So I'm not sure many of us, although we had opportunities to think about the results while we were putting the paper together, they always feel a little bit different when they're out there and you start to get a bit of commentary. So it's an interesting journey presenting this for the first time, and I'm going to be quite reflective on some of the parts of the process as well as some of the results. So whilst I certainly don't disagree with my co-authors, as time has passed, my views on some of the results have modulated a little bit. So I've got a couple of conflicts in that I was a member of both the CPET Methods Group and the International Steering Committee of METS, and I've discovered from our trust that I also have to declare conflicts relating to relationships. So I'm married to the POETTS chair, which some of you may know. So METS has taken about 10 years to come to fruition and become a paper in the Lancet. And it was originally a study conceived by a chap called Brian Cuthbertson, who's a professor of anaesthesia critical care in Aberdeen. He's principally a critical care trialist, but had a particular interest in some of the biomarkers. So it was originally envisioned as a study of the relationship between brain natriuretic peptide and mortality at 1 year, with CPET as a comparator. And over time it evolved. It went twice to the HTA in the UK and didn't get funded. Brian was then headhunted to be the chair at Sunnybrook in Toronto, at which point Daminda Wijayasundara, who's a brilliant young Canadian researcher, took over, and he had a bit of a track record, well, he had a good track record in looking at cardiac risk in terms of the revised cardiac risk index, and it was then submitted to Canadian funders. And it just evolved over time. So whilst originally we were looking at mortality at 1 year, the Canadians, so you think of PJ Devereaux, Vision, etc., are much more obsessed by cardiac outcomes, so the primary outcome variable changed to the one that we'll see here, which relates to myocardial injury and cardiac pathology. So just bear that in mind as we go through the story. And I think this fundamental difference between focusing on the heart and focusing on the patient, and my perspective is there is a tendency, and I'm certainly not tarring all American doctors with that brush, but there's a tendency in the US, because of historical practices around referral to cardiologists before CPET, to think much more about cardiac risk, and in the UK, Europe and Australasia, a tendency to think much more about general complications and accept cardiac risk as one of the areas to worry about, but probably not the dominant area. And there are very clear philosophical differences. If you hear people like Daniel Sessler talking about the blood pressure data, he's absolutely convinced it's all about the heart, and that's what dictates most of post-operative outcome. And although some of the North American data seems to reflect that, it's very hard to identify very bad cardiac outcomes in most of our, or the European, or the Australasian data. They seem to be a relatively small proportion of adverse outcomes. If we're talking generally about assessing risk, there are a spectrum of technologies we can look at, from straightforward subjective clinical assessment through to more complex scales, and then biochemical markers, and then more complex functional tests, including CPET. And there's an increase in cost and complexity along that spectrum. And if we're looking at functional capacity, which I guess is a subset of risk based on the assumption that functional capacity is related to risk, then we've got the same pattern. And within METS, each of these categories was represented. So there's a clinician subjective assessment input variable, which was classified into 3 levels of concern about fitness, plus a don't know box. There's the DARSI, there's a Duke Activity Status Index, which I'll show you the detail on in a moment. The plasma biomarker is the sort of leading candidate as a plasma biomarker, which is N-terminal pro-brain natriuretic peptide, which is probably the most well-studied and the best candidate in this circumstances. And the functional measure was CPET-derived VO2 peak, on the basis that that will be the easiest to identify, so you don't have to worry so much about some of the issues around skill of identification of anaerobic threshold. So the METS studies, you'll notice that the title changes a little bit between this, which is the methods paper, and the main paper, but that's understandable and doesn't happen infrequently. So the methods are well published. The design is clear. It's a robustly conducted clinical trial, multi-centre. And this is the structure. So at the beginning, you have those 4 different types of assessment. The patient then has surgery, and that's important because not all the patients manage to get all the assessments and surgery, so the analysed data set is on a subset of the total number enrolled. And then in hospital, they have surveillance for myocardial infarction. So this isn't simply people who are diagnosed as having a myocardial infarction in the post-operative period, but there's daily ECGs for the first few days. So you can detect infarctions that might otherwise be silent, but you wouldn't know at the time clinically, because that's only in the trial surveillance, if that makes sense. The reason I'm highlighting this point will become clear in a moment. You've also got daily biomarkers, so you can detect a myocardial injury and non-cardiac surgery, so-called MINS, so a troponinitis, if you like. So the primary outcome is 30-day mortality in myocardial infarction, with a secondary outcome which is 30-day mortality and myocardial injury. And then another secondary aim is the mortality at 1 year, and a final secondary aim is in-hospital complications. It's an international multi-centre study, so 5 centres in Canada, 7 in the UK, 10 in Australia, but tending to be, because they joined later, they're often smaller numbers per centre, and 3 in New Zealand. And these are the inclusion criteria. I'm not going to dwell on them particularly. They're a reasonably standard set of inclusion criteria for major surgery. I guess they're more complicated than some might be. Some studies just go for the straightforward, let's aim for over 2 hours or 500 mils blood loss to identify major surgery. And these are the exclusion criteria. There's a feeling that we might have got a slightly less major surgery group than some studies. So some sets of criteria and some studies manage to identify patients where there's clearly quite adverse outcomes. But as you'll see from the results, the outcomes are not that bad from this. And in fact, the outcomes turned out to be better than predicted. And the study had to be extended mid-course. And therefore, the event rate is relatively low, so that may have some relevance to the level of prediction for the events. So the mortality rate was about half that which was expected. For those of you who don't know the DASI, this is the Duke Activity Status Index, which was designed to be a quiz that would reflect your VO2 peak. So that was the intent of it in the first place. So it asks a number of questions about different types of activities, and based on the way you score, and you can see the scoring down one side, it comes up with a number that should reflect your VO2 peak. You would absolutely expect this to be correlated with VO2 peak. Conduct of the study over several years involved the enrolment of 1,741 patients, which was, as you can see, 23% of those eligible. So when you see those sort of numbers, there's always the risk that there's a bias in that you've only got a quarter of those who possibly could take the study, and for some reason some consented and some didn't, of which only just over 1,400 had the CPET test and surgery and the biomarkers. So the analysed data set is 1,400, so it's about just over 80% of the total enrolled group of patients. That's as planned. And to give you a flavour, so median age of 65, just under 40% female, and the vast majority are ASA physical status 2 or 3, so moderate to high risk, but on that blurred boundary where subjective allocation can take you either way. It means there's very few 1s and there's very few 4s. So possibly not as high risk as some studies I've mentioned already. There's very little missing data, so it's a good quality data set. This is a CPET meeting, so I throw out the CPET safety data. I mean, essentially this is very reassuring and I think probably reflects what most people see in their normal practice with cardiopulmonary exercise testing. Very small number, so 3 episodes of syncope across 1,400 tests, for example. And from a cardiopulmonary exercise testing point of view, I don't think there's any concerns, but it's a useful reference point. This describes what sort of patients are coming through. You'll note that a significant proportion, so a quarter, were orthopaedic patients, and I think there's only 1 death in the orthopaedic group, so they're not contributing much to the adverse outcome. You can see about half have a general anaesthetic alone, about a third have a general anaesthetic with a regional, and the remainder just have a regional, and about half have an arterial line, 15% with a central line, and very few with a cardiac output monitor. And only about a quarter get admitted to critical care. Bearing in mind, it's not very difficult to get admitted to critical care in North America. That, again, nudges us to thinking this is a relatively lower risk group. The mean peak oxygen consumption was 19.2 mils per kilo per minute, and the mean VO2 at AT was 12.6 mils per kilo per minute, which is certainly higher than our experience of what you see in an all-comers service for major surgery. So separate from this, our experience with studies about exercise is that fitter people tend to like enrolling in them, and less fit people are sometimes less attracted to the notion of having their exercise evaluated or having to do some exercise intervention. So given that only 23% of those who were eligible entered, there's a possibility of a bias towards more fit folk in the study, which might explain the slightly better outcomes. And this is a plot. So this one here is the subjective assessment plotted against VO2 peak, and you see that they're loosely related, but there's actually no statistically significant association. The dominant message that will come through from this study is that we're not very good at assessing functional capacity. So we may think we are, but certainly when evaluated in a clinical study, it appears that we're very bad at assessing clinical capacity. The DARSI was somewhat better associated with subjective assessment, but also no statistical significance overall in terms of that relationship. So either using the score or the index or the test, the subjective assessment was pretty poor at assessing what the actual functional capacity was and was unrelated to any outcome in any way. That is quite a striking message, that our clinician subjective assessment is unrelated to all the outcomes that I described to you. The different variables that are continuous variables, so the DARSI, it's a categorical variable, it's got enough gradation to perform as like a continuous variable. DARSI, the peak oxygen consumption, and the NT-BMP are correlated in the way you might expect, but you can see there's enormous spread on those data. So these are the correlation coefficients, and they're basically low. They're Spearman's row because it's categorical data for most of them. The best correlation is between DARSI and VO2 peak, which means only about 20% of the change in VO2 peak is explained by DARSI or vice versa, and it's substantially less for the other two. So although these things are related, they're not as tightly related as you might expect in this study. I'm really going to go into this in quite a lot of detail, and I think it's really important to do so because it's quite hard to understand this study if you don't. These are the outcomes. The primary outcome reported in the paper is this one. If you remember, this was chosen in the end because it was likely to be accepted favourably by the grant funder. So within the first 30 days, there are 28 deaths or myocardial infarctions, but you'll see there's only 5 deaths, and there are 24 myocardial infarctions. So that composite is dominated by myocardial infarctions, occurring at a pretty low rate, less than 2% across the whole study. The secondary composite is death and myocardial injury, of which 176, so completely dominated by the myocardial injury. The deaths are irrelevant to that outcome. So the secondary outcome is essentially troponitis. Death at 1 year, just under 3%. And you see that in-hospital complications, severe complications, there's less than 15%, but they were a more frequent complication even than the MINS, the troponitis. So the dominant adverse outcomes are not cardiac in this study, although the headline outcome is a cardiac outcome. And if you look even more closely at the myocardial infarction, remember there were 24 of them, 14 of them were insufficient to merit any treatment of any significance. So if you get an MI, you expect to get a bit of aspirin and other medication, but the majority of the MIs are ones that were not identified clinically at the time, but were identified on screening subsequently. Therefore, they're the lowest category of Clavien-Dindo adverse outcomes. So these are not major complications. The statistics are presented in 3 separate ways, just to confuse you even more. Area under ROC curve, which I guess we're largely familiar with. So if the area under the ROC curve is a half, so the straight black line across that diagram, that's the equivalent of flipping a coin. The test has absolutely no predictive ability at all. And as the curve moves up and towards the left as you look at it, the predictive ability increases so that if you had a perfect test, it would be 1 and the curve would follow the lines of the box. And above 0.9 is absolutely extraordinarily good, and above 0.7 is becoming acceptable, and below 0.7 is, to be honest, pretty rubbish. So there's also adjusted odds ratios from a regression analysis, and then net reclassification index, and this basically says over and above the basic model, and I'll explain what the basic model is, does using this test give me any additional information that would change my decision at a particular time? Now, the literature will argue about which are the best ways to look at it, but in some ways the net reclassification index is what you would intuitively think about in terms of clinical decision making. I'm going to go through these results basically twice in 2 different ways so it's clear what's going on. So the first run through, the primary outcome, which is death and myocardial infarction within the first 30 days, remember, completely dominated by myocardial infarction, of which most were asymptomatic. The DARSI is associated with, so regression model, there's an adjusted odds ratio, says associated with, but doesn't add any incremental predictive value. So the end 3 columns, and in fact, in particular, the p-value at the end, non-significant. For 30-day death and myocardial injury, both DARSI and NT-BMP are both associated with and have incremental predictive value. But I'm not terribly surprised that NT-BMP, which is essentially a cardiac biomarker, is associated with troponin, which is a cardiac biomarker. I know they're different biomarkers, but it's a slightly circular argument. It's interesting that the test that DARSI adds additional predictive value, but I'm also not sure about the outcome. So troponinitis, although MINS is a very popular construct in the States, it's unclear how important it is in comparison with, say, major complications. In hospital, moderate or severe complications, peak VO2 is associated with and has additional incremental predictive value. And for 1-year mortality, NT-BMP is the only measure that is both associated with and has an incremental predictive value. So none of the others are related in a manner that is statistically significant. So I'm now going to present you the same results all over again, but just to try and reinforce the message. So the area under ROC curves are all not very good. The best is actually VO2 peak and complications, and there's a handful of others that just about get into the 0.7s, but none of them are very impressive, which is quite surprising because that's substantially worse than the previous literature to date. This is the net reclassification index. The net reclassification index, basically there are only 4 significant positive results. DARSI and NT-BMP for the injury, so the troponinitis, CPET for complications, and BNP for death. And for the adjusted odds ratio, so the association with, you add in DARSI being associated with the myocardial infarction and death. So if you go through those, for the outcomes, that's the DARSI is associated with but not predictive of the primary outcome. Myocardial injury, that's a reasonably clear message with both association and predictive ability. Same for VO2 peak and same for NT-BMP. So I hope that was reasonably clear. So face value interpretation, subjective assessment, useless. DARSI, good, but with a little star, because, so good for predicting death plus MI and death plus MINS. And the star's there because if you think of we looked at it in 2 statistically different ways. One of them said yes and one of them said no. So it's not standing up brilliantly to a sort of sensitivity analysis. CPET appears related to complications and BMP appears related to death at 1 year. So these are the conclusions as stated in the paper. So can't argue with the first one. Subjective assessment of functional capacity is not a good idea. And then the second one is that we should consider DARSI for cardiac risk assessment. In a previous version of the paper, before the peer reviewers got at it, it also said consider CPET for complications. And that stays in the sort of larger box that's presented that's kind of an extended abstract that the Lancet commonly use in their papers. So one of their implications is perhaps CPET to predict major complications after surgery. So that's the, in brackets, third finding. But the reviewers clearly like the notion that DARSI should be used to predict the primary outcome if you think the primary outcome is important. So I'm going to close. The conclusions are 3 or 4 slides long because I've tried to conclude from a number of different perspectives. So one of the things about this study is the relative importance of different outcomes, both in terms of their importance to the funders and their importance to us clinically and their importance culturally. So the cardiac outcomes versus general outcomes, US versus Europe, for example. And I think it's important to think about that when you're interpreting the study. I'm surprised by the relatively weak statistical links given the data that's come before, but it was a well-conducted, robust study. I've commented already on the impact of the funding process on the trial. I think this is supportive of the notion that unfit people avoid studies that are about exercise, and that's probably worth someone having a look at some point. And I think the secondary analyses are going to be really interesting. So there's a complete gold standard CPET analysis, because the CPET data is what the clinicians who did the test at the time thought the answer was. So they just entered 2 numbers, AT and VO2 peak, onto the CRF, done. But the full CPET tests are available, and they've been analysed by 2 separate experts who, if they didn't agree, a third one had a look, and if they differed by more than 5%. So there will be a gold standard CPET analysis. And it's a big study. Some of the subsets of patients are substantial enough for there to be additional looks at what that data looks like. So as someone who's been associated with CPET for a long time, I'm kind of reassured that it does predict complications, and the sort of major complications that I think are, certainly in the short term after surgery, what are our major clinical challenge and what patients worry about. I'm disappointed and a bit surprised it doesn't predict mortality, but that's what the data says, and it's pretty clear. NT-proBNP performed better than I'd expected, but that's reassuring, and I think we need to, certainly in Southampton, we're thinking about how we might integrate that into our practice. So the fact that it predicts 1-year mortality, I think, is a significant contributor, for example, to collaborative decision-making. And Darcy is interesting, but I think I'm suspicious that the abstract will be over-interpreted, and people will say, right, Darcy, that's it, done. Actually, if you look more deeply, the outcome it's predicting may not be the most important outcome, and the link with that outcome is actually not as strong as is implied in the summary. Thank you.
And don't forget you can meet the Top Med Talk team. All you need to do is turn up at one of our events. Check out edpom.org for more details. edpom.org. Our next big event is between the 28th and the 30th of September in Chicago. That's EdPom USA, the Chicago Masters Course, Perioperative Care Practicum. Between the 28th and the 30th of September. edpom.org for more details. That's edpom.org.